afternoon, everybody. Today I'll be talking about the claim made by Danielle Powell a couple of weeks ago regarding the high demand of coffee leading to the current harmful conditions of our environment. She has two main supporting claims. One of them is that the high demand of coffee caused the shift from traditional single type of coffee to the breeding of coffee plants to make this hybrid coffee plant that, in her own words, require agrochemicals and full exposure to sunlight to be mass produced, therefore leading to the deforestation because apparently that requires more space. Fact number one is that prior to the 19th century, farmers had to explore different techniques to avoid losing their crops. This is because of an outbreak of leaf rust, and that's the actual main reason, according to Reginald Smith, a contributor of the book Coffee, Botany, Biochemistry, and Production of Beans and Beverage. This is what led to the development of the hybrid plant, which she actually does not define. That's misleading because hybrid coffee is not harmful. It's just a reference to a natural cross between Arabica coffee and Robusta coffee plants, originally discovered in Brazil. And this type of coffee is particularly important because it became the backbone for all of the other coffees that we know today. And the trait that makes this hybrid coffee special, I guess, will stand out in her claim, is that the genes that it contains are actually necessary for the plants or cultivars of coffee to thrive. This is according to coffeelands.org. In addition to that argument, not every type of hybrid coffee requires full exposure to sunlight or is even harvested the same way. For example, one of the most popular hybrid coffee plants is Bourbon coffee, and this type of coffee actually requires the shade of tall trees and requires cool temperature to thrive, as described by a coffee grower himself. Third, Danielle also misrepresents some of the information obtained through one of her sources. She uses Forest Alliance as support of her claim that the demand for coffee leads to deforestation. Forest Alliance is actually an organization that works with hundreds of farms around the world to conserve and support coffee farms by providing a healthy soil, waterway, climate-smart techniques, and even resources for the coffee growers themselves. This evidence for her first claim is problematic since it's contradictory to support her own claim, and it leaves out important facts that the audience would have required to, make a more, to be actually more accepted of the claim. Her second supporting claim is that nitrogen, which later appears in water sources such as rivers, have led to significant amounts of water pollution. The fact is that she didn't provide enough evidence to arrive at that conclusion. She didn't provide any proof that or evidence that people are actually dumping nitrogen into the water. Of course, that's illegal anyway. She makes a reference to wet processing as the only form of coffee processing which involves nitrogen. However, that's only one of the two processes that coffee growers use. There's also dry processing, and both processes are optional, but each process is a required step to get the ultimate coffee product. This is according to the National Coffee Association. And finally, Danielle only presents one of the negative effects of nitrogen, but there are other possible effects of nitrogen left over from coffee grounds. For example, according to Jennifer Nelson, an educator of horticulture at the University of Illinois, coffee grounds that contain about 2% of nitrogen make them a potential and safer alternative than using manure as a fertilizer in agriculture. In conclusion, Danielle's claim does not provide sufficient or credible proof to support her argument that the high demand for coffee is what's harming the environment. And if anything, coffee trade is one of the leading contributors of our agricultural profits. Thank you.
Well, I thought your argument on the nitrogen issue was a little bit stronger and clearer than the argument on the first point, especially with the counterclaim that you have at the bottom that suggests that the coffee grounds themselves could provide the nitrogen and replace the use of manure that would be potentially dangerous to the environment. So I think that that mitigates the issue a little bit. You do have an argument here that suggests that it's unlikely that the nitrogen is being dumped in the waters. You basically assert those points. You say it's illegal. Again, you assert that. And then you talk about wet processing versus dry processing. And you mentioned that you have to kind of have both. I'm going, okay, but how does that show that the nitrogen is not getting into the environment in a harmful way? I'm not quite clear on that. So I think you've got some good arguments there, but there's also some inconsistency. Speaking of inconsistencies, you have a nice point that suggests that the advocate's evidence comes from a source that is in fact engaged in the very thing that the supposedly are condemning. They're doing a variety of things to protect the soil. You mentioned the Forest Alliance, for instance, and it sounds to me like there is some mitigation of these factors going on. And I think that would be the clearer argument, instead of suggesting that the advocate has misrepresented the evidence. I think what you ought to demonstrate is that the evidence indicates that where there are problems, people are aware of it and they're trying to do something about it, because that's what the information actually says there. And I think that's a stronger argument than, hey, you're quoting somebody who actually feels differently about this than you say they do. I think you kind of miss the value of the argument with that answer. And then the argument about the different hybrid plants and that sort of thing and what's required. I don't remember what all of the advocates' statistical information was on these points. It would be helpful if we had some sense of proportion. How many acres are we dealing with? How many acres use the open technique, and how many have the more closed technique that we're talking about that don't require the sunshine? You mentioned some breeds of coffee that in fact don't need this and they thrive with the shade that's going on. So it sounds like, well, why don't we grow that kind of coffee in the places that are environmentally sensitive and the other kind of coffee in places where it isn't a problem? And there's not really an explanation about why you have to do one or the other. And I don't remember that explanation coming from the advocate either. So I think there's a good press to be made here that says that's the advocate's responsibility to show that these things are incompatible and that we couldn't be doing something like that. So I think you found some good arguments to make, but you're not always getting the full utilization out of those arguments that you might be getting. Thank you.